The restaurant buzzed with soft music and chatter as family and friends gathered for the rehearsal dinner. Candles flickered on the tables, casting warm light over polished silverware and glasses filled with champagne. Margaret sat at the corner of the long table, watching her son and his fiancée as they smiled and greeted guests. She had chosen a bright coral dress that made her feel cheerful, even youthful. It had been a long time since she'd worn anything so bold, and tonight, she wanted to feel alive. As the evening went on, someone told a joke at the other end of the table. Margaret, catching the end of it, laughed. Not a loud, wild laugh, but full and genuine. For a moment, she forgot how careful she usually tried to be. Her hand rested lightly on her chest as she chuckled, but as her laughter faded, she noticed the shift in the room. Eyes turned toward her. Whispers followed. And then came the voice, sharp, cool, and far too loud. Her daughter-in-law, Jenna, smiled sweetly, but spoke with a tone that cut like glass. "You should act your age, Margaret." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. For a brief second, the entire table froze. Then came the soft, uncomfortable laughter. Some guests chuckled politely, others looked down at their plates. Margaret felt the heat rush to her face. Her cheeks burned as her smile wavered. She forced a small laugh of her own, hoping to soften the moment, to show that she could take a joke. But inside, something cracked. The humiliation settled into her stomach like a stone. She lowered her eyes, stirring the untouched salad on her plate, pretending not to notice the glances, the raised eyebrows, the whispered exchanges between relatives who now saw her as silly, as embarrassing, as someone who didn't know her place. Her son didn't say a word. He stayed focused on his fiancée, pretending not to hear. That hurt more than the comment itself. The room buzzed again, but it sounded distant, muffled under the weight of her shame. She sat perfectly still, smiling softly, nodding when spoken to, but her mind spun. She heard the clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation, but none of it reached her. She had raised her son, poured years into his happiness, his future, and here she was, at his wedding rehearsal dinner, feeling like an unwanted guest in a life she helped build. Her fingers lightly gripped the edge of the table as her chest tightened. She wanted to disappear, to slip away unnoticed, but she sat there, holding her smile like a fragile mask, afraid that if she let it drop, the tears would follow. The night continued without her. People laughed and toasted, oblivious to the small fracture that had formed inside her. She kept smiling, she kept nodding, but deep inside, something had shifted. Something inside her had broken. And somewhere beneath that pain, something new began to stir. The morning light poured through the window as Margaret sat in her small living room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The quiet hum of the house was familiar, but her thoughts wandered, pulling her back through the years. The photo frames on the wall seemed to whisper their stories, each one a window into the life she had once lived. She looked at a picture of herself, much younger, standing. In a bright red leotard, her arms raised gracefully in mid-dance. Her smile back then was wide, her eyes sparkling with dreams. She had loved to dance. For years, she trained every day, dreaming of stages and lights and applause. It was a world that made her heart race, that gave her joy like nothing else. But life had its way of changing plans. She met her husband when she was only 22. He was charming, full of promises, and ready to build a life. When she found out she was pregnant, her world shifted overnight. The dancing shoes were carefully packed away. The rehearsals stopped. The stage lights dimmed. She told herself it was temporary, that there would be time later. But later never came. Instead, her days filled with bottles, diapers, and midnight feedings. She rocked her son to sleep, humming softly while the rest of the world slept. She watched his tiny chest rise and fall, feeling a love so deep it almost hurt. As he grew, So did her responsibilities. School projects, scraped knees, late-night fevers, she handled them all. Her husband worked long hours, and often she was alone with the weight of it. When he struggled in his job, she picked up extra work. She babysat for neighbors, cleaned houses, and even worked nights at a small diner to make sure there was always food on the table. She never complained. She never asked for help. She was the steady one, the quiet supporter who carried the family forward. The photos continued along the wall like a silent timeline. Birthday parties she had planned, complete with homemade cakes and colorful balloons. School plays where she clapped the loudest. Holidays where she stayed up late wrapping gifts and cooking special meals. Every smile in those pictures had her behind it, making sure everyone else was happy. But somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing her. She wasn't Margaret, the woman who once dreamed of dancing under bright lights. She became Mom, Honey, Grandma. Roles she wore with pride, but roles that slowly erased the woman she used to be. As the years passed, the calls came less often. The visits grew shorter. The appreciation turned into expectations. She was always there, so they assumed she always would be. They forgot the sacrifices, the long nights, the silent tears she shed when no one was watching. They forgot that before, she was theirs, she was someone too. Margaret ran her fingers lightly across one of the frames, tracing the edges. The smile in the photo stared back at her, a younger version of herself, full of light and possibility. She swallowed the lump in her throat. She had given them everything. Every dream she set aside, every hour she worked, every piece of herself she offered without asking for anything in return. And now, after all those years, she had become invisible to them. A background figure. Someone to tease for laughing too loud or wearing a bright dress. Her chest tightened, but she took a deep breath. She had no regrets for loving her family, for building a life for them. But for the first time, she allowed herself to see the full truth. They didn't remember who she was before she gave it all away. But she did. The woman in the red leotard was still inside her. Buried, maybe. Faded. Perhaps. But not gone. The next few days passed with quiet tension. Margaret kept herself busy, helping where she could, folding napkins, organizing place cards, making sure the flowers stayed fresh. She wanted to feel useful, to still be part of her son's big day. But beneath her calm smile, a heaviness sat, in her chest that she couldn't shake. One evening, as the house buzzed with last-minute wedding preparations, Margaret moved quietly down the hall to return some linens to the closet. The door to the den was slightly ajar, and inside she heard voices. She paused, not intending to eavesdrop, but something made her freeze. Jenna's voice floated through first, light and amused. "Honestly, I hope she doesn't wear anything too bright again. That coral dress at the rehearsal dinner was a bit much." Margaret's stomach tightened. She leaned closer, barely breathing. "I know," her son replied with a soft chuckle. "She means well, but she can be embarrassing sometimes. You know how she is." There was a pause, followed by Jenna's sharp, sweet voice. "She just doesn't know when to let go of trying to be young." Her son sighed. "Yeah, but what can you do?" Margaret stood frozen, her fingers tightening around the folded linens. The words hit her like tiny knives, each one cutting a little deeper. She felt the sting behind her eyes, but she forced herself to stay quiet, not daring to let a single sound escape. They weren't angry words. They weren't shouted in frustration. That made them hurt even more. It was casual, easy, like discussing the weather. As if she were some distant problem they simply had to tolerate. Margaret backed away slowly, careful not to make the floorboards creak. She returned to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. The numbness washed over her like a heavy wave, pulling her under. She had done everything for him, For years, she had given up pieces of herself so he could thrive, and now she was a quiet embarrassment. Something to work around. Later that night, as the house settled and the voices died down, there was a soft knock on her door. She composed herself quickly, wiping at her eyes before answering. Her son and Jenna stood there smiling, but with a strange tightness in their expressions. "Mom," her son began gently, "we were thinking, just to keep things simple for the reception, maybe you could sit out that part of the evening. You know, let us handle the dinner and dancing. It'll be crowded, and we don't want you to feel overwhelmed." Jenna chimed in with that same sweet tone. "Of course, we'll have a seat for you at the ceremony. But the reception can get a little tiring for everyone. It's just easier this way." Margaret felt the lump return to her throat, but she nodded quickly. She smiled, careful not to let it waver. "Of course," she whispered, her voice even. "Whatever makes things easier for you." They both smiled, relieved, thanking her before leaving her alone once again. As the door closed, her smile faded. She sat there for a long time, staring at the closed door, her hands resting on her lap. A single tear slipped down her cheek, tracing a warm path along her skin. She wiped it away quickly, as if even the walls might be watching. In that quiet moment, something inside her shifted again. Not the sharp crack of the rehearsal dinner, not the raw shock of overheard whispers, but a slow, steady fracture. The kind that doesn't scream or shatter, but breaks all the same, and somewhere deep inside, behind the numbness and the hurt, a small spark began to flicker. The days slipped by quietly, one after another, each one folding into the next like pages of a book no one was reading. Margaret sat by the window most mornings, a cup of tea resting between her hands, watching life move around her while she stayed still. The sun rose and set, neighbors walked their dogs, children rode their bikes, cars hummed down the street. The world continued, but without her in it. Her phone sat on the small table beside her, cold and silent. Days passed without a single ring, without a single message. She checked it sometimes, just in case she had missed something. But there were no missed calls, no waiting texts, only the quiet screen reflecting her face back at her. The wedding had come and gone. She attended the ceremony, sitting quietly near the back, smiling politely, clapping when expected. She went home alone before the reception began, as they had asked. No one followed up. No one called to see how she was feeling. They were too busy posting pictures, sharing memories, laughing in photos she would never be a part of. When her birthday arrived, the silence was louder than any words could have been. She woke up early that morning, telling herself it was just another day. She prepared a small breakfast, sat at the kitchen table, and waited. Maybe someone would remember. Maybe her son would call, even just to say hello. The hours passed. Noon turned into evening. The phone remained still. She lit a candle on a small cupcake she had bought herself the day before. The flame danced gently, the only movement in the still house. She closed her eyes for a moment before blowing it out. The soft puff of smoke curled into the air, disappearing like the hope she had tried to hold on to. Holidays came with the same emptiness. The table that once held laughter and plates of food now sat bare, untouched. She didn't bother decorating that year. What was the point? The ornaments remained packed in their boxes, tucked away like forgotten memories. Even her closest friends seemed to pull away. At first, they would check in every so often, short calls and polite texts. But as time went on, the space between messages grew longer, invitations stopped arriving. When she reached out, the responses were brief, distant. She could hear the hesitation in their voices, the discomfort they tried to hide. They didn't know what to say. They didn't want to get involved. Margaret sat by her window in the evenings, watching the world carry on. Couples walked hand in hand, families gathered on porches, friends laughed together under the glow of porch lights. And there she sat, unseen, like a shadow pressed against the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, older, softer around the edges, eyes that carried the weight of years no one seemed to see anymore. She traced her finger along the edge of the window pane, her chest heavy with the quiet ache of being forgotten. She wondered, not for the first time, if she had let this happen. Had she given too much? Had she made herself so useful, so accommodating, that they stopped seeing her as a person at all? Had she loved them so deeply that she disappeared inside of them? Her voice, once filled with songs and laughter, had grown quiet. She rarely spoke now, except to herself. She would murmur softly while folding laundry or cooking small meals. The sound of her own voice was sometimes the only thing that reminded her she was still here. Margaret blinked away the tears that threatened to fall. She wouldn't cry. Not tonight. Not again. She had shed enough tears for people who no longer cared to hear them. The house, once full of life, now echoed with emptiness. Every room held memories of what was, of who she used to be. And yet, in that emptiness, something stirred. A question whispered softly in the back of her mind, growing louder with each passing day. Did I let them erase me? And as the moonlight spilled across the floor, Margaret sat in the quiet, feeling the weight of that question settle over her like a heavy blanket. The rain tapped softly against the window as Margaret moved through the attic. She hadn't been up there in years. Dust floated in the thin beams of sunlight breaking through the cracks. The air smelled like old wood and forgotten time. She had come looking for nothing in particular, just something to fill the empty hours. But as she pulled back a faded sheet covering a stack of boxes, her hand paused. The box was familiar. The handwriting on the lid was hers, written decades ago in thick black marker. Margaret's keepsakes. She slowly opened it, the cardboard, edges soft from years of waiting. Inside were pieces of a life she had quietly packed away. Photographs sat neatly on top, their edges curled. She picked one up carefully, brushing away the thin layer of dust. There she was, standing on a brightly lit stage, captured mid-dance. Her body was graceful, strong, alive. The smile on her face glowed with a joy she hadn't felt in years. Her arms stretched wide, caught in motion, frozen in time. She flipped through more photos, her in rehearsals, her in costume, her backstage with friends. Each picture whispered of a version of herself she had almost forgotten. Beneath the photos was a carefully folded piece of bright fabric. Her breath caught as she pulled it out. It was her red dress, not the coral one she wore to the rehearsal, dinner, but the real one. The one she wore when she was young and fearless, when the world was still wide open in front of her. The fabric still shimmered faintly under the attic light. She held it up, running her hands over the smooth material, feeling the memories stitched into every thread. Without thinking, she slipped the dress carefully over her clothes. It was a bit snug now, but it still fit. She walked over to an old full-length mirror leaning against the attic wall. The glass was a little foggy, but she could still see herself clearly enough. She stood there, studying her reflection. Her hair was grayer, her face lined with years of life lived. But her eyes, they still held something. On impulse, she twirled. Once, the fabric flowing out around her like it used to. For that brief moment, she wasn't the forgotten woman sitting quietly at the window. She wasn't the burden who had been told to act her age. She was the woman who once lit up stages, the woman who had passion and dreams, the woman who was still here. Margaret let out a soft laugh, one that sounded younger than she had in years. The spark inside her chest flickered brighter. She placed her hand over her heart, feeling it beat strong beneath her palm. As she stood there staring at herself, something shifted. Not a sudden dramatic burst, but a quiet decision forming. She was still here, she was still her, and she didn't need anyone's permission to feel alive again. She gently folded the dress back into the box, but this time she placed it on top, not hidden beneath the old photographs. She carried the box downstairs and set it in her bedroom closet where she could see it every day. That night, she brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table. The silence that had once weighed on her now felt different. She stared at the flickering candle in front of her, the flame dancing gently. Maybe she couldn't change the years that had passed. Maybe she couldn't force them to see her. But she could see herself. And that, she realized, was the beginning. Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her. She looked out the window at the dark sky, her reflection faint in the glass. Tomorrow, she would take one. Small step. She didn't know exactly where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to move forward, not as someone's mother or someone's burden, but as herself. The spark inside her chest glowed softly, steady and sure. The decision settled quietly in Margaret's chest. She didn't need to argue or explain. She didn't need their approval or permission. For the first time in a long time, she was making a choice just for herself, and she was going to do it her way. The next morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied her reflection. She gently pushed her gray hair back, running her fingers through the soft waves. The lines around her eyes spoke of years lived, but they no longer felt like weaknesses. They were proof that she had endured. She picked up the phone and called. The small salon in town, a place she hadn't visited in years. "I'd like to make an appointment," she said softly, but with a steady voice. A few days later, she sat in the salon chair as the stylist worked carefully, trimming and shaping, her hair into a simple, elegant style that framed her face beautifully. They added soft highlights that caught the light when she turned her head. Margaret looked at herself in the mirror and smiled. She wasn't trying to be someone else. She was simply allowing herself to shine again. Next, she visited a boutique. Downtown. The woman behind the counter welcomed her with a kind smile. Margaret quietly explained she was looking for new shoes, something comfortable but graceful. She found a pair of deep red heels that matched her dress perfectly. They weren't flashy, just beautiful in their simplicity. She slipped them on, standing tall as she admired the reflection of her feet in the small mirror on the floor. While she was there, she also picked up a small clutch, some simple jewelry, and a soft silk scarf. Each item felt like a quiet piece of her confidence returning. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. She kept her preparations private, protecting her peace from any more cruel remarks or dismissive glances. This wasn't for them. It was for her. A week before the wedding, an email arrived. The final RSVP reminder. They had expected her to decline after their earlier suggestion. But this time, she selected yes. She would attend both the ceremony and the reception. She didn't reply with a message or explanation. She simply confirmed her place. Next, she booked a hotel room near the venue, a small suite, quiet and private, with a lovely view of the gardens. She wanted her own space, free from the tension of shared family rooms, free from whispered conversations behind closed doors. Each quiet step brought her closer to something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet power, steady and calm. There was no need to raise her voice, no need for fights or dramatic scenes. She was in control now, and that was enough. The red dress hung carefully on the padded hanger in her closet, the silk gleaming softly under the bedroom light. She had taken it out of the old box, steamed it, and let it breathe again. Every time she glanced at it, she felt the same gentle spark inside her chest. The night before the wedding, she packed her small suitcase carefully. The dress, the shoes, the jewelry, all placed neatly inside. She added a few personal touches, her favorite perfume, a soft shawl, a tiny bottle of her favorite hand lotion. Little comforts that made the moment hers. As she zipped the suitcase closed, she paused for a moment, letting her hand rest on top of it. The quiet in the room no longer felt empty. It felt full, with peace, with certainty, with strength. She wasn't going to the wedding to prove anything. She wasn't going to confront anyone. She was simply going to show up as herself, the woman they had overlooked, underestimated, and tried to silence. The woman who had never truly disappeared, no matter how much they acted like she had. Margaret turned off the light, pulled back the covers, and settled into bed. As she closed her eyes, her heartbeat was calm and steady. She didn't need to raise her voice to win. She had already won. The wedding day arrived with clear skies and soft sunlight pouring through the windows of the hotel suite. Margaret stood, in front of the mirror, her red dress fitting like it had been waiting for this moment all along. The silk hugged her frame perfectly, graceful and elegant. The soft curls in her hair framed her face, and the delicate necklace at her collarbone shimmered gently under the light. She applied a touch of her favorite perfume and took one long, steady breath. She didn't feel nervous, not anymore. There was a calm that had settled deep inside her. The fear, the humiliation, the sadness, they had all burned away, leaving behind something stronger. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she stepped into the lobby. The driver opened the door to her car, and she slipped inside, sitting tall, her hands resting gracefully in her lap. The ride to the venue was quiet, but inside her chest, a steady rhythm pulsed. When the car pulled up to the grand ballroom, guests were already mingling outside. Soft music floated through the air, laughter rising and falling like waves. She stepped out of the car slowly, the red dress catching the sunlight, drawing eyes almost instantly. Conversations faltered as people noticed her. Heads turned. Some gasped softly. Others whispered behind cupped hands. Margaret didn't falter. She stood tall, offering polite nods as she walked through the crowd, her heels steady against the pavement. The bright red dress moved fluidly with each step, like a flame weaving through the sea of muted pastels and quiet grays. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers glittered above tables, dressed in white linens and gold trim. The music swirled gently in, the background blending with the hum of conversation. As she entered, more heads turned. A hush followed her, like ripples moving through water. Her son saw her first. His face froze, his eyes wide, mouth parting slightly as though words had suddenly escaped him. The bride, standing beside him, went pale. She blinked rapidly, her smile faltering into something tight and forced. But Margaret didn't look away. She gave them both a gentle, knowing smile, polite, unbothered, steady. She was not here to seek their approval. She was not here to fight. She was here because she belonged. The music shifted as the DJ announced the start of the evening's dancing. The floor opened, inviting couples forward. Margaret walked calmly toward the dance floor, each step graceful and sure. A few people clapped softly, unsure at first, but drawn into the energy she carried. The DJ, catching her eye, gave a small nod and smile. Without hesitation, Margaret stepped onto the polished wooden floor, the red dress fanning slightly as she moved to the center. The music swelled, a slow, steady rhythm filling the room. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting it wash over her. Then, with a soft turn, she began to dance. Her movements were smooth, elegant, filled with a grace that came from years of practice and years of waiting. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply being who she had always been. The whispers faded as the guests watched her, drawn in by the quiet power she carried. Some clapped along with the beat. Others smiled, genuinely impressed by the beauty of the moment. A few wiped tears from their eyes, moved by something they couldn't quite put into words. Her son stood frozen, his face unreadable. The bride's jaw tightened, her fingers twisting nervously around her bouquet. They had tried to keep her out, to shrink her, to hide her away. And yet, here she was, more radiant than ever. Margaret's eyes sparkled under the lights as she twirled once, the red fabric swirling like a flame. The music filled her body, and for the first time in years, she felt completely free. She danced, not for them, but for herself, for the girl who once dreamed, for the woman who sacrificed, and for the strength that never truly left her. When the song ended, the room burst into applause. The DJ gave her a quiet thumbs up, and she smiled warmly. Margaret stepped off the floor with the same calm grace she carried when she entered. She returned to her table, lifted her glass of water, and took a slow sip. Across the room, her son and his bride could only stare, trapped in the quiet realization that they had underestimated her completely. Margaret didn't need to say a word. She had already taken everything back. The morning after the wedding was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the soft curtains of Margaret's hotel suite as she sipped her tea, seated comfortably in the armchair by the window. The soft hum of traffic below mixed with the distant sounds of birdsong. Everything outside felt light, as if the world itself had shifted ever so slightly. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The first message appeared, glowing on the screen. "Why did you do that, Mom? You embarrassed everyone." Another followed moments later. "You made a scene. This was supposed to be our day." Margaret let the messages sit there, her face calm. She picked up the phone, reading the words slowly, letting them pass through her like a breeze she no longer felt the need to resist. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before tapping delete. The messages vanished as easily as they had appeared. More messages came throughout the day. Her daughter-in-law tried too, with carefully chosen words wrapped in thin politeness. "We just wish you had respected our wishes." Then her son again. "You've always made things about you." Another delete, and another. There was no anger inside her. Not anymore. Just a cool distance, a quiet understanding that she no longer needed to explain herself to people who had never truly seen her. For years she had swallowed words, softened her tone, kept peace at her own expense. But now silence was her reply, and it spoke louder than anything she could say. She slipped on her walking shoes and draped a light scarf over her shoulders. The small town streets were calm this morning, with a cool breeze and the faint scent of spring in the air. She walked, slowly, taking in the sights she had overlooked for so long. The bookstore on the corner, the coffee shop with the tiny outdoor tables, the flower stand with fresh-cut blooms lined up in neat rows. With each step, the weight on her chest lightened further. The echoes of their disappointment couldn't touch her here. They were trapped in the world they had built, full of control, full of expectations, full of small, selfish wounds. She had stepped out of it, and now walked freely in her own space. At the flower stand, she paused and bought a small bouquet of daisies, the yellow centers bright and cheerful against the white petals. She smiled softly as she carried them with her, their simple beauty matching the peace she felt inside. The phone buzzed again as she reached a park bench, but she didn't bother checking this time. She sat down, placing the flowers beside her, and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warm sun wash over her face. For so long, she had tried to shrink herself, to stay small and unbothersome, believing it was the price of being loved. But they hadn't loved her smaller version. They hadn't valued her sacrifices, her quiet patience, her endless support. They had taken it as a given, and when she dared to shine even a little, they called it embarrassing, but not anymore, in naive. The stillness of the park, with the soft chatter of children playing in the distance and the wind rustling through the trees. Margaret finally felt something she hadn't felt in years. Seen. Not by them, but by herself. She didn't need their validation. She didn't need their apologies. What they thought no longer had power over her. The woman who had stood on that dance floor in her red dress was still inside her, stronger now than ever. The silence she offered them was not bitterness. It was freedom. She was done explaining, done defending. She had spoken her truth in the clearest way possible, by living it. Margaret opened her eyes and watched a small bird land on the edge of the fountain nearby. It dipped its head to drink, wings fluttering lightly. Life continued, simple and beautiful, as it always had. Her phone buzzed again in her purse. She let it ring, untouched. She was no longer waiting for them to call. They had called, but she didn't pick up. And she never would again. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting gentle patterns across the wooden floors of Margaret's home. She sat at her kitchen table, slowly stirring a spoon through her tea, watching the ripples form small circles that faded into stillness. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. Her eyes wandered to the framed photo sitting nearby, a picture of her younger self on stage, caught mid-dance, glowing under bright lights. The red dress shimmered even in the faded photograph, its color as bold as the confidence she once wore so easily. For so many years, she had tucked that version of herself away. She had dimmed her own light so others could shine, believing that was what good wives and mothers did. She had whispered when she wanted to speak. She had stepped back when she wanted to move forward. She had said yes when her heart whispered no. All those years of being careful, of staying proper, of acting her age. Margaret traced the edge of the photo frame with her finger, remembering how it felt to move freely across that stage, to let the music fill her bones, to feel fully alive. That girl was never foolish. She wasn't selfish or embarrassing. She was full of life, full of passion, and she had been brave enough to dream. But somewhere along the way, she let their voices replace her own. The small comments that piled up over the years: don't make a fuss. Don't wear that color. Don't laugh so loud. Act your age. She followed those rules, believing that being quieter would make her loved, that being smaller would make her easier to keep. And for a time, she thought it had worked. They depended on her. They leaned on her. But they never truly saw her. She sacrificed her passions, her dreams, her own place in the world so they could build theirs. And when they no longer needed her to hold them up, they called her a burden. But now, sitting alone in her quiet kitchen, she saw it all with clear eyes. She wasn't a burden. She never had been. She was their foundation, the one who kept the house standing when storms came, the one who worked quietly in the background, filling the cracks they never noticed, the one who made sure birthdays were celebrated, meals were cooked, bills were paid, and wounds were healed. Without her, none of it would have been possible. And when they tried to push her aside, to silence her one last time at the wedding, she had stood up, not with anger, not with shouting, but with grace, with power, with that red dress and a quiet dance that said everything without speaking a word. Margaret smiled softly to herself, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady breath. She was proud, not just of the dance, but of the strength it had taken to reclaim herself, of the courage it took to finally stop asking for their approval. She didn't need their applause. She didn't need their permission to feel alive. She had found her way back to herself, and that was enough. Her gaze shifted out the window to the small garden blooming outside. The flowers stood tall, reaching for the sunlight, unbothered by who noticed their beauty. They bloomed simply because it was in their nature to do so. Margaret stood and stepped out onto the porch, letting the soft breeze brush against her skin. She looked up at the sky, its wide blue stretch reflecting the openness she now felt inside her. For years, she thought, staying small would keep her safe. But in truth, it was the moment she allowed herself to expand again, to fill her own life, that she truly became free. She whispered softly, her voice carried gently by the wind. Maybe I wasn't the burden after all. And in that quiet moment, she knew she had never been. The evening sun dipped low, casting soft golden light across the cozy dining room. Margaret moved gracefully around her small kitchen, humming quietly as the simple meal finished cooking. The air smelled of fresh herbs and roasted vegetables, warm and comforting. The table was set for one, her favorite plate, a cloth napkin, a single candle flickering gently in the center. Nearby, hanging neatly on a padded hanger, was the red dress. The same one that had once lived in the attic, tucked away and forgotten. Now it hung proudly, like a silent reminder of the night she finally stepped back into herself. She poured herself a glass of red wine, the rich color catching the light as she carried it to the table. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate. Every small task was done with care, not because anyone was watching, but because she wanted to. Margaret sat down, the chair softly creaking beneath her as she settled in. She took a slow sip of the wine, letting its warmth fill her chest. The soft music playing in the background blended with the quiet of the room, creating a calm rhythm that matched the peace inside her. For years, this kind of silence might have felt heavy, even lonely. But tonight, it was different. It was hers. No one interrupted. No one sighed at the way she laughed, or commented on the color of her dress, or told her how she should act. There were no sharp words disguised as jokes. No careful steps around other people's moods, just the steady heartbeat of her own presence. She picked up her fork and took the first bite, savoring the flavors she had chosen for herself. She didn't need a grand feast or loud company to feel full. She had learned to nourish herself in ways that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. The red dress swayed gently on its hanger as a breeze drifted through the open window. She glanced at it and smiled, her eyes warm and steady. That dress had once been a memory of what she lost. Now it was a symbol of what she had reclaimed. She thought of the voices that once tried to shrink her, telling her to quiet down, to blend in, to act her age. She thought of how easily she had once accepted their judgment, believing that loving others meant making herself smaller. But not anymore. Now she knew her worth didn't live in their approval. It lived here, in the simple, beautiful stillness of a life she built for herself. Margaret took another sip of wine, the candlelight flickering softly across her face. The clock ticked gently in the background, each second marking a quiet kind of victory. She looked around the room, at the space she had filled with things that brought her joy. The soft blankets draped over the chair, the vase of fresh flowers on the windowsill, the small collection of books stacked neatly nearby. It was simple. It was enough. It was hers. And then, softly, as the breeze rustled the curtains, she whispered, to herself, her voice steady and proud, "This time, I ate at my table, alone and free." The words floated into the air, settling gently around her like a warm embrace. And for the first time, being alone felt like exactly where she was meant to be. They told me to act my age, but I decided to act like myself, and that was more than enough.